Well, hello and welcome to the MQZP indicator suite tutorial videos. And in this video, I will be covering the QuantiZer, which is the oscillator. So let's dive straight into it. All right, we have a Bitcoin chart, and let's see. Let's go to the wrong list. Let's see. Let's take the Binance Futures one because it actually has better volume signal. We'll need that later. Right, so once you have access to it, you can add it to your charts. Here we go. Now, initially when you load it up, it will just look like a regular RSI indicator. But you'll notice that in the background it has like a fainter oscillator, which is the MQZ oscillator that I custom built. Let's dive into the settings. Now, if you haven't watched the introduction video that I did previous to this one, I suggest you check it out in case you want to know kind of how the color system works in the indicators that I built. But I'll just give a very quick overview. You have the top setting, which is this row here that has the general color setting for the entire overlay. So each section subsequent to the general one, as long as its setting is set to indicator, will synchronize with the colors that are used above here. But if you choose custom, then you can override it with these colors basically. So I'm gonna set it to light mode in this case. These are kind of like the colors that I usually use when I'm in light mode. So once we activate some signals, you'll see that it's using red and blue actually instead of these colors. Right, the Confluence Tracker, it's this thing here, which has like 3 symbols, but I will cover that later once I've explained actually what all these signals mean. Excuse me. So let's see. Initially, when you load it up, you see that it automatically loads the oscillators. This is just to kind of turn everything on and off. That is because maybe you want to run this in the same panel as one of your other indicators. So basically you can overlay them in the same pane. I'll show it later. And then if you don't need the oscillators because your other oscillator already has an RSI in it, so you don't want 2 RSI in the same panel, you can basically deactivate this one, but you can still see the Confluence Tracker here, which can give you all the signals without actually displaying the oscillators. Right, so that's kind of like a quality of life thing, but yeah, we'll check it out later in more detail. Right, so we have the oscillators. I will first cover the RSI because that's probably the one that people are mostly familiar with. I suspect most of you already have seen it somewhere or are using it yourselves. So what I will quickly do is just increase the width of the oscillators a bit so you can see it a bit better. But yeah, it's the dark one. The dark one is just kind of the standard RSI. And yeah, we'll start covering some of the options that my oscillator gives you, right? So you have the colors. We can kind of like read the tooltips if we want. These are the main themes. As you can see, dark mode, aqua lavender, it's hard-coded. Light mode, blue, red, hard-coded. Monochrome is this one, etc., etc. Not too exciting. This is related to the Confluence Tracker, so we'll skip that for now. We'll come back to it later. These are the colors in the section of oscillators. And as you can see, color 1 is the MQZ bearish color. Color 2 is the MQZ bullish color. Color 3 is the RSI, or also the monochrome color. And color 4 is the MQZ minimum momentum. That's actually an extra color because the MQZ oscillator, which we'll cover after the RSI, actually gives 3 different signals. And the third one is a neutral signal, so that's why there's an extra color there that we'll see in a little bit. So what it's saying here is that if you want to change the color of the RSI, you can do that actually with this color, right? So you can see how it now changes color. The one that you see in the background, which is the faded one, plus the bands as well, they all use this color at 30%. Those are hard-coded, and in the introduction video that I previously mentioned, it is explained as to why I use that color specifically, but I can showcase it now as well, is that if you use that color in light mode or in dark mode, in both scenarios, it's more faded than the other color, basically, right? So you can easily flip between light and dark mode, and it will always be the faded oscillator, not suddenly change or like inverse the relation between the two oscillators. Right. But yeah, for now these are hard-coded and you cannot change them, so just keep that in mind. Right. So for now we'll ignore the fainted one for a little bit. Just don't really pay that much attention. We'll cover it after the RSI. And yeah, let's go. So RSI. This row, as you can see, we read the tooltip at the top. It says RSI divergence settings, right? So setting 1, RSI divergence mode, which would be this setting, right? Setting 1, setting 2, setting 3. So setting 1, it says RSI divergence mode, backtest, full history of divergence signals, right? But it also says it's resource intensive. What does it mean? So if we put this on backtest and then we activate the RSI divergence signal here, it will show you all the RSI divergences that it detects, right? But it will do so for the entire history. So if you zoom out, you'll see them like pop up all over the place, right? These are all the RSI divergences that it's detecting. But generally speaking, if you're not doing any sort of backtesting, you're just tracking the current market, you don't really need to see all these, right? So therefore, I created the option that says the second option, last type, only the last divergence of each for bearish and for bullish, right? So if you put it to last type, you'll see that now there's only 1, 2, 3 on the bearish divergence and 1, 2 and the bullish divergence. And if we scroll back, there's probably a few more here, right? But in total, if you were to scroll all the way back, there should only be 4 bearish divergence and 4 bullish divergence visible right now. And the reason for that is because the way I built the RSI oscillator in my indicator is that it tracks divergence across 4 different methods. So it's not just simply, let me just kind of get an arrow so I can point at some stuff. It's not just tracking, let's say, the divergence between this and this, right? It's also tracking divergence between this and this, or between this and this point. So it's doing various methods of tracking divergence, right? So basically what you're seeing is one of each type, which means that if a new divergence comes in, whichever type it is, it will turn off, let's say, this one and then actually appear here, right? But you'll never see more than 4. And the same goes for the underside. This is just much more resource efficient, so the oscillator will just load much quicker. It will not lag your chart as much if you have like a lot of stuff going on, and so on. And then the last one is last type plus lines. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, I suppose. It adds a divergence line, so it's actually showing you where it's tracking the divergence from, right? So if we activate that, you'll see like some dashed lines appear, and now you can actually tell like, hey, okay, so it's tracking the divergence from, as you can see, right? So from this divergence here, it's not divergent with this point, it's actually with this point here, right? So now you can kind of see like where it's tracking the divergence from, which is just a kind of quality of life handy trick, I suppose, right? Hope that makes sense. If we then go back to the settings, then there's 2 more. So second and third one, if we read, it says RSI divergence filter for high time frame and RSI divergence for low time frame. Note, RSI divergence filters add margins above and below which RSI divergence signals are ignored. All right, so what's it mean? Let me read a bit more. It says example 5 will set margins at 75 and 25, and another example is setting it to 20 will set the margins at 90 or 10. Recommended settings for high time frame 4 hours and above is 5, for low time frame 2 hour and below is 20. Those are just kind of like my personal preferences, but you can change them obviously, that's why the options are here. And then at the very end it says 1 is the minimum, so you cannot set this setting, neither of these two settings lower than 1. And if you set it to 30, which is the maximum, then they're essentially off and they're not doing anything, right? Now, let me just make this a little bit bigger. I hope you guys can see it. But there's actually a horizontal line right here and another one right there, right? So these are these margins that it's talking about. And we are currently on the daily time frame, so that's higher than the 4 hour. So that means it's actually tracking the second setting, right? RSI divergence filter for high time frame, 4 hour and above. So that's this one. So what it's doing is it's setting a threshold limit 5 points higher than the top band of the RSI and 5 points lower than the lower band of the RSI, right? 5 points of difference. And any RSI divergence signal that comes in above the higher one or below the lower one will just straight up be ignored, right? That's the reason why you don't see divergence here, right? Because there's divergence here, but there's no signal. And that's the reason because this band here is lower than this point, right? So you can increase that, let's say all the way to 30. And let's put this on backtest mode so you can actually see what's happening. Right, so now it's showing all these divergences, right? But if you put this back to 5, and you can also see the horizontal line is now way up here, right? It's at 100 because 70 plus 30 is 100. But if you put it to 5 again, you press enter, you'll see that this line switches back below, and now these divergence signals disappear, right? So now it's just tracking these ones because they're below this band. That's kind of hard to see. I hope you guys can see it on the video. And yeah, the inverse is applies to the bullish divergence, obviously, right? And yeah, so you have two settings, one for high time frame, one for low time frame. So you can customize this however you want. You can have a look at, let's say, on the 1 hour. Make this line here smaller. Right, so you can see that there's a whole bunch of divergences here happening, which, you know, they are legit. But yeah, you can see that the horizontal line is like right here, so it's fair enough that they're below this line in between this margin, and they are counted as divergences. But if you were to set this to 5, just like the high time frame, then there we go. The line now shifts below, and it's not detecting these divergences anymore, right? So that's how that works. You can set this however you want. You can, like I said, set this to 30 if you don't like this feature and you don't want to use it. You know, that's up to the user. One important note that the tooltip has at the very bottom is says divergence filters settings will affect alert triggers. So make sure to configure or disable them properly before creating divergence alerts, right? So if you want to use some of the alerts, built-in alerts, and you want to have bearish divergence or bullish divergence, just keep in mind that the settings you have here will affect how these are detected or not. So set the configuration properly before setting the alerts. That's basically what it says. As you can see, it so happens to be the case that with all this scam candle shenanigans, we have some signals going off. And that's basically what the Confluence Tracker does, right? So the Confluence Tracker, this thing, it's enabled. If we disable it, this will disappear. There we go. So what it's doing, it's tracking the signals it has detected in the last 6 candles, basically, right? And you can set this higher. See? Setting 1, set the number of bars for signal extension. So when it detects a signal, it will keep that signal active for 6 more bars. And setting 2 is the positioning. All right, this is something important in the sense that I have this deactivated by default, but I can just quickly activate it and show you. In this chart settings, if you go to Canvas, on the section of buttons, you have navigation and pane. So if you have always visible, you see that there's some TradingViews by default has some buttons here that, you know, cover up this positioning basically of the Confluence Tracker. Yeah, I don't like these. I think they're kind of redundant. Because yeah, if you want to delete the pane, you can just, you know, delete the oscillator. If you want to move it up, you can also just do it here. If you want to maximize it, you can double click it. So I don't know, like I don't like these buttons. I have them deactivated always, like fuck it. Yeah, but just know that that's there, so in case you see this and it's getting blocked by TradingView with the other buttons, then you know where it comes from, right? But yeah, so the second option here, as it says, it's the Confluence Tracker positioning, and you have 3 values, 1, 2, 3. 1 is top right, which is the default, which is where it's now. If you set it to 2, it will go to the top center. So now it's actually in the center. And if you set it to 3, it's the bottom right? So set this to 3, and now it will switch to this positioning here, right? So you can move it around if you want to keep those buttons there because you like them. Then you know you have 3 different options as to where you can place the Confluence Tracker. Personally, I just like to have it there. I might in the future actually reactivate, because I do have them kind of in the code but disabled at the time for the other indicators in the suite that also have a similar feature that then also falls exactly in this corner, so you have everything like nicely tucked together. But yeah, we'll see in the if I reactivate that in the future when if people request it or I decide to use it again. Right, so that's the Confluence Tracker. It's tracking all 3 signals that the oscillator can provide. As you can see, the RSI is not yet firing off. Interesting actually, because it looks like there's a divergence here, but yeah, anyway, we'll cover that a bit later when we covered all the other signals as well, and I will do some showcasing of like how it works. All right, let's see. So that's the RSI divergence. I wanted to say something else. Yeah. So when you have the Confluence Tracker active and you have these buttons here, what you can actually do is just hover over one of them. Let me just see. There we go. There's more tooltip information here. So relative strength index, divergence, it's all time frames. Confirmation bars is 2 bars. So what does it mean? So for a divergence to play out, let's just take these because these are like kind of nice and obvious, right? So the RSI high comes in here, right? And then the divergence comes in here, right? So for the divergence to appear after this high, which is higher than this high, and the RSI being lower, it's basically divergence. So once this candle closes, the first one closes bearish, then that basically essentially creates the divergence, right? But the signal from the oscillator will actually not appear until the second one, or not trigger, confirm, basically until the second bar also closes bearish, or at least closes below this high, right? The reason I do this is because it helps just eliminate a lot of the noise. But one thing to keep in mind, and that's at the very bottom of this tooltip, it says, despite a 2 confirmation bar requirement, divergence signal will display in real time of the second confirmation bar as long as the conditions are met. What does that mean? It means that although if you set the alert will not trigger until this candle closes, when this candle is still in progress, as long as it's below here, the signal itself on the oscillator will already appear, right? So once the first candle closes, the signal appears, but the alert will not trigger. The alert only triggers when the second bar also closes bearish, right? In this case, because it's a bearish divergence, and obviously vice versa for the bullish divergence. All right, so that's what it means by having 2 confirmation bars. All right, so if you continue reading, indicates bullish and bearish divergence. It's also gives you a little symbol of what it looks like. Tracks divergence through 4 different methods, which I already kind of mentioned. That yeah, it's tracking different points on the RSI for calculating divergences. So sometimes it's not super obvious as to where it's tracking the divergence from. And in that case, it says there as well, note divergence signals. Excuse me, my voice is just... Let me just drink something. Divergent signals can sometimes seem misplaced. If so, cross-reference current price with previous RSI extremes, because usually what happens is that it's actually tracking an extreme RSI point. By extreme, I mean the very tippy toppy high that the RSI has made in the last kind of like, you know, price action. Yeah, so sometimes it's can look kind of weird, like, hey, there doesn't look to be a divergence here, and then yeah, just kind of cross-reference as to where all the RSI extremes are previously, and then usually you can kind of find, oh, it's actually tracking divergence from here to there, and it's like not as obvious as it looks. Yeah, note divergence and RSI extremes can be ignored by adjusting the limit thresholds in the settings panel. Use these to avoid signal noise when RSI is building very large divergences, right? So if you go back to the daily, because we know we used that example previously, right? So when RSI really goes into overbought territory, like so way up high into the 90s, what usually happens is, yeah, it starts creating divergence here, right? Which is basically here. This is, oh, come on, give me that, there we go. Right, so it's already tracking divergence here, right? But it's not necessarily the divergence that you're interested in, right? Because as you can see, like right away, it just kind of keeps pushing up, and in the end, what happens is that it creates divergence all across this entire region, right? And then after that is when you actually, this is the divergence that you're interested in, right? This one, because this one is that actually creates the move downwards. And as you can see with the current settings, because the limiting threshold is right here, it ignores all these divergences here and actually points only out to this one, right? Which is exactly the one that you want. Now, obviously nothing is perfect. This is just my way of filtering out a lot of the divergence noise when you just build a random or like a standard RSI divergence without any sort of logic to filter any sort of signal. It will just, you know, have a million divergences everywhere, and I just, yeah, this is my approach of kind of filtering it. And then the same thing here is, yeah, you get another divergence, right? But it's beneath the threshold, so they will indeed signal. And yeah, if you then, instead of using the backtest mode, use type and lines, you can actually see that, hey, right, so there's now only one. That's because since this moment there has been another one of another type that has, you know, consequently moved. For example, maybe it's this one that jumped from here to there, right? Because it can only display one of each type. I kind of hope that that makes sense. Let's see, anything else that I'm missing in terms of RSI divergence? That's pretty much it. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. How you can set the limit thresholds and then kind of filter out some of the noise. And yeah, for high time frame, for low time frame, you can set them equal, you can set them differently, you can turn them off by setting them to 30. Yeah, I think that's good enough. All right. So what we'll do now is we'll turn the divergence off, so no more divergence signal. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually turn off the color on the RSI. So now we only see the MQZ oscillator. Right, so this is kind of the star of the show. This is the one that I built custom built. And what it's tracking momentum. So it's quite different than your typical RSI indicator or something like that. What does it mean, momentum? So it tracks momentum in terms of the trend, right? So here we can see the trend is up, right? And here we can see how momentum from this point onward just kind of like shoots upwards, right? Now, as you'll note, here's a downtrend, and here, during that downtrend, momentum also shoots up, right? So by itself, it's non-directional in a way. It's in both cases, whether the trend goes down or the trend goes up violently, momentum will shoot upwards, right? So by itself, you cannot really tell without looking at price as to if it's bullish or bearish. And yeah, what that means is that the indicator by itself doesn't necessarily visually indicate you exactly as to what you're looking for, right? But basically, the concept is still kind of the same in terms of, compared to an RSI, is that you have a condition that's like very low, and you have a condition that's like very high, above the band, below the band, kind of like the same thing, right? But what's cool about this is that you can kind of tell that, you know, for example, you have this, you know, uptrend, and then you get a bearish divergence here. But in this time, the momentum is still telling you that momentum is upwards, right? So if we now activate the signal, or the MQZ Oscillator, which by the way stands for Momentum QuantiZer. That's just kind of a meme in terms of my username that I usually have, MQZ. And yeah, it's just a nice acronym, I guess. If you activate the signal, then you get this at the bottom that gives you kind of a bullish signal and a bearish signal, and then the neutral orange signal, which is this color, right? Now, depending on how you have your chart layout and stuff, it might be a little bit hard to see. So what I did is in the Style tab, you have one extra setting here that's Momentum QuantiZer background signal, and what it does, it just colors the background in the same color as the signal, so it's just a bit easier to see, right? So keep that in mind. You have this extra option there if it's kind of hard to tell what the signal color exactly is, right? So now we have the signals active, and what you can see is that the QuantiZer is now, from this moment onwards, kind of signaling bearish, red kind of signal. Now, obviously, by itself, it's not something that you would instantly trade, right? It's just one signal. I would recommend, you know, combining this with your own personal strategy and the things you look for. This is just meant as an extra Confluence signal if it's something that you think would help you with your trading. And yeah, so kind of the way this works is, let me just actually activate the RSI again, so we can see them both in action and how they play off each other. It's a signal. Let me turn on again. There we go. Now we have them both again. And yeah, there we go. So what it's basically telling you is that this is obviously, as you can see, a very strong uptrend. But not until this red zone ends, which you can see here that this is the moment where, let me actually change this color because it might be a bit, let's see, let's use green, maybe a bit brighter green. It's not until this moment here where the MQZ oscillator switches momentum, right? So the momentum here is up, 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 which means the trend is just going to keep going, and then here's where it slows down. Now, what this usually means, not all the time, but usually means, is that this is the momentum when the trend kind of runs out of steam, right? And you can kind of see that reflected in that it goes up very, very fast, and then it kind of just, you know, starts slowing down, right? And what I kind of like about it is that it basically tells you that, hey, this is, in this zone is usually where the RSI builds its most extreme point, right? Because if you didn't have the momentum indicator and RSI is kind of like going up, then you cannot really know if the RSI is just going to kind of do a thing and then just keep on going even higher, right? Until it hits up into the hundreds. Now, obviously, this is a very extreme case. So if you look at like another case, you can kind of compare them. If you go to a bit more recent price action. Right, again here, very violent momentum upwards, and when the red zone ends, it means momentum has kind of shifted now. And instantly what price does is it just kind of stalls out, right? So the momentum indicator doesn't necessarily mean price goes up and then it instantly reverts down again, right? It can be that price goes up and goes sideways, or it can be that price keeps going up, but it kind of does a bit slower, right? But usually what it kind of predicts is that this is the RSI extreme, and from this point onward, the RSI is gonna start building the divergence, right? As you can see, right? Red signal comes in here, and then the RSI starts building kind of a divergence kind of thing, right? So that's how I use it most of the time. It's a signal that kind of lets me know that, hey, yeah, we might get, you know, a bit more of a higher push, but usually that means that divergence is building. So the red signal comes in like around here, but it doesn't mean that I instantly go short, right? It means that I'm gonna start watching for divergence usually, right? Same thing applies as with other indicators, the general rule that the higher the time frame, the more meaningful the signal is, right? So if you get a momentum signal on the daily, then it's probably more important than a momentum signal on the 1 hour, for example, right? So just also keep that in mind. Yeah, and the same kind of thing for the other direction. And so if you look here, we get a violent move to the downside, right? We get the momentum signal right around here, right? We get a bullish one in this case. This is the moment where the RSI kind of locks in the most extreme point, and then from that point onwards, it builds the divergence, right? As you can see, and then this is kind of like your preferred entry point. Okay? Look, it can kind of help you in time your entries better, I suppose. Kind of ignore all this kind of, you know, bullshit, if you will, and spot potentially like better entries, right? Doesn't mean that you can't, you know, if your strategy says to go long on this candle, then, you know, by all means, I mean, that's your prerogative. It's meant as a signal to kind of help you time stuff a little bit better. And yeah, it's like I said, not 100% perfect, but for those that find it interesting. I think the wind is moving something in my living room. Okay, let's continue on. Yeah, so and then we have a third signal, which is the orange signal, like this one here and this one here. And that is what's called the minimum momentum signal. So if there's definitely a ghost in my house. We discussed the maximum, the high momentum that happens above the RSI band, essentially. So here and here, right? This is when momentum peaks above band, and here. The reason it doesn't trigger here is because the logic is obviously a little bit more complicated than just that, and for whatever reason it doesn't trigger here, right? So yeah, it's not that it's broken or not working as intended. There's just some more complex logic behind the scenes that actually, you know, says that this is not an interesting point for the MQZ oscillator. But yeah, on the inverse, we have it when it dips below the band, right? So like this, and like here, it kind of just touches the band, but yeah, the idea is the same. And what this means is that momentum is at an absolute minimum. So volatility is very, very low. So you can see that in this case, like you get very tiny candles right here, and like kind of like right here in this area. Right, very small. These are daily candles, by the way. Like look how small they are. Right, there's a what's the range on this? Right, so we're stuck in a 0.5, 0.7% range or something. Right. Excuse me. Yeah, and what I mean is that what I would suggest is market makers are kind of manipulating, containing the price in a very tiny, small percentage range, and completely compress volatility. Nothing's really happening, and then this signal triggers, telling you that momentum is at an absolute minimum. And basically what it's telling you is that any moment now, after the signal ends, so when the orange signal ends and momentum starts picking back up, as we can see higher, that it just suddenly starts to pick up again, right? You get the breakout, right? And one observation that I made while building this is that what you often see is you get a fake out to the one side and the trend actually shifts to the other, right? If you can see here as well, it's kind of like fake out to the downside, but then the trend actually shift upwards, right? I suppose that's just, you know, the typical market behavior of liquidating some shorts or some long before actually going into the direction it actually wants to go. That's kind of how I interpret it. Yeah, here again you have, you know, the actual bottom that came in at the beginning of, or at the end of last year on Bitcoin. Strong momentum to the downside, which means high momentum. It RSI dips below the band. The momentum indicator kind of stops around here, telling you that momentum to the downside has potentially come to an end. And then it just kind of like drifts a little bit lower while creating the divergence, right? So yeah, you'll if you start like backtesting this, you'll see this kind of like play out over and over again. So yeah, I recommend just kind of like, you know, playing around with it, just looking at different charts, different time frames, and yeah, kind of figure out how you interpret it. That's kind of like the way I interpret it. I like the analogy of driving a car. Is basically the momentum indicator is your gear shift, if you will, and when you're on the motorway, you shift all the way up to 5th gear or 6th gear if your car has more than 5. And then normally what happens is that if you predict that you have to brake, you don't wait until the very last moment and then just slam the brakes and try to stop, you know, instantaneously in one hit, right? What you do is you let go of the gas, and then the car starts to slow by itself, and by the time you get to the point where you want to stop, then you just slightly hit the brakes. And yeah, that's kind of like the analogy that I like to use, in the sense of, you know, this is where you let go of the gas, and then the car kind of keeps rolling, and it creates a divergence. And then eventually you hit the brake here, and then it shifts, and you do something else, right? Yeah, if we go to the tooltip here on the Confluence Tracker, right? So remember, you have to have this active because otherwise it doesn't show. We can read some of the things that I just explained, right? So we have the momentum quantizer, minimum and maximum. It displays on all time frames. It has one confirmation bar in this case, so there's no extra bar of delay when the signal triggers. Maximum momentum. So those are the highs on the MQZ oscillator. They can be bearish or bullish. So that's, you know, it's a little bit counterintuitive when you're not used to it, maybe. So it takes a while. So just, you know, give it a second to kind of like sink in. Can be bearish and bullish. It occurs at the end of strong moves and trends, right? So if you have a strong trend or strong move to the upside or to the downside, that's usually when they start appearing. It occurs at the start or of accumulation or distribution. So this is kind of a reference to Wyckoff theory, if you're familiar with it, right? As you can see here, right? So the signal comes in around this area, right? Basically what you get is kind of like a mini Wyckoff range with a UTAD, right? And then the last point of supply or whatever it's called, and then it kind of, you know, shifts the direction of the trend, right? But the signal actually comes in right around here, right? So it kind of tells you like, hey, we might be shifting into either sideways, or sometimes on the lower time frames it actually means like you don't get any divergence at all and it will just shift downwards. We'll have a look at the lower time frame after this, right? And then basically the blue signal, the bullish signal, is kind of like the reversal of that, right? So you get the blue signal like kind of around here, and what happens is that, yeah, it kind of enters this kind of like, you know, range, if you will, and you have like the UTAD or jump the creek or whatever it's called, right, at the end of it, and then it kind of pops out, right? Here you have another one of those minimum signals, kind of like right here, fake out, down, right? Let's see, what else? So occurs at the start or of accumulation or distribution, indicates a shift in trending conditions ahead, right? So it's a predictive signal in a way. It often precedes RSI divergence signal, right? Again, like I explained previously, it sort of pre-signals when the RSI is gonna start building divergence, right? So it kind of warns you that, hey, when the signal comes in, don't immediately try to go short, because it's likely that RSI is still gonna be building divergence before the trend actually shifts into another direction. And at the very bottom of the maximum momentum, it says RSI extremes are made during peak momentum, right? So like I explained before, you can see that RSI peaks right in the middle of this red zone, and it does so here as well. Here it comes a little bit later, but yeah, more or less, right? After one of these signals, it's very rare for RSI to make a lower low than this point or a higher high than this point, right? It's kind of telling you, like I said, from which point onwards the RSI is likely to divert. Now, let's cover the minimum momentum. So a neutral, non-directional signal, the orange one, right? The orange signal doesn't necessarily tell you in which direction the trend is gonna go. It just tells you that volatility is very low at the moment, like minimally low, and it's very likely to just break out after this, right? Which direction it's gonna break out, it doesn't necessarily tell you. That's up to you to figure out with your strategy, your technical analysis knowledge, and so on and so forth, to kind of figure out in which direction it's likely to go. Okay, let's see. Oh, I'm already 40 minutes in. Wow, this is going way longer than I expected. Yeah, a signal occurs at the end of accumulation distribution. So let's just kind of draw that up again. Remember, we get the signal here. We kind of enter in this accumulation or distribution pattern, the Wyckoff theory kind of thing. And then, yeah, price just kind of drifts down after that. And right at the end of it, basically when the market maker just kind of finally lets go of the manipulation, if you will, it creates the fake out, and then the volatility comes and it actually goes into like the direction it wants to go. So these tend to happen right around those moments, or at, for example, like fractals, right? It also says on the next setting, occurs at apex of fractals, like for example symmetric triangles or rising wedges, and then anything that kind of compresses price into a tight kind of spot, right? So you can see here there's kind of like an ascending triangle kind of thing going on, and then at the very apex of it, right before it breaks out, that's kind of like where the signal comes, right? And yeah, if your strategy allows you to kind of find an entry around this spot on maybe like a lower time frame, then you can very effectively time your entries, ignore all this chop and bullshit here, and just enter right before the move happens, and you know, get a nice little pop, and then maybe get out when the red signal ends or something, right? So yeah, that's up to you to kind of figure out how this could complement your own strategy and employ it that way. Okay, so let's kind of jump down to a lower time frame to kind of see what it looks like there. Now, as you can see, it kind of becomes quite a bit more noisy now. You know, just like any other oscillator, I suppose. But for the most part, the rules kind of still apply, right? So if you look, for example, we're on the 1 hour now. This is just some bullshit candle about some fake news about the Bitcoin ETF. So we can ignore that pretty much. But yeah, we get a little bit of a move down. Volatility, momentum is actually quite high, and it shifts like right around here, right? Very short divergence, but it's there. And price does indeed kind of, you know, shift upwards a little bit. It's not a big move, but it still detects a correct kind of shift in momentum, like at least a sort of a retest of this level here, right? So yeah, on the lower time frames, you have to be a bit more nuanced about it, and keep in mind that since it's a lower time frame, the moves might not be as big as they would be on like a daily time frame, for example. But then again, you can see here the signal comes in around here. I think there is some divergence, or no, not really. It's more or less an equal low. That's why there's also no signal on the RSI. But yeah, as I said, it doesn't necessarily mean that prices, instantly after the signal just gonna shoot upwards. Instead, it can also just, go sideways for a long period of time. The momentum, what it's telling you is that there's a shift. It doesn't necessarily tell you there's a reversal coming, right? We go from downtrend into sideways, basically, right? So sometimes it's a signal for a very short period of time. Sometimes it's actually a reference to a signal that's kind of like on a little bit of a bigger, longer time frame kind of scenario. And yeah, again here we can kind of see that on the lower time frames, you can get multiple signals in a row, just like you can get multiple divergences in a row, right? Because there is divergence from here to here, and there is divergence from here to there, and like none of these actually play out. Because yeah, there's something much bigger building, right? So just keep that in mind. You can see also the minimum momentum also gets a little bit more noisy. But yeah, generally it still kind of, gives you like a nice signal here, right? Just right before the entire kind of thing breaks down. Let's see. Here we have another example. So the first signal comes in here, which indeed it doesn't produce that big of a move, but it produces a little bit of a shift, because we have this kind of uptrend going, and then it creates like a tiny retrace before it just, the scam candle comes in and just liquidates everybody. And then we get some new signals here. One right around here, and the other one ends right about, after this. And then after that is when the final divergence comes in here, right? The divergence that actually matters, which is the top one, right? With the big kind of engulfing candle downwards. And yeah, so it's kind of more of a signal that gives you like a heads up, like, hey, there might be a top nearing, right? It's not necessarily means like you should go short right away or long in the inverse. It just so happens that all the examples I'm pulling are on the bearish side. So yeah, again, another one here. Let's just, for the sake of argument, find a couple of bullish one. Here we have another one, right? We get a decent move to the downside. And what it's signaling here is a shift in momentum, because maximum momentum has been reached to the downside. It does not produce a sort of a reversal move. What it does is it just signals a move of like, hey, momentum has shifted. And instead what we can see is that it just kind of stalls for a long time with some minimum momentum signals thrown in the mix right here in this kind of area. And then yeah, it takes a little bit longer, but eventually you get a tiny fake out and then another move to the downside, right? So yeah, man, my throat is killing me tonight. Sorry about that, guys. Aye. Yeah, another bearish signal again. Wait for the divergence, right? Sell signal here, or high momentum bearish signal here. Wait for the divergence, right? Divergence actually comes in here, right? But it's already telling you like, hey, we might not go much higher than this point. Like maybe we go a little bit higher, yeah, sure, but it's probably gonna be a divergent higher high. Let's find some bullish ones here. Right. So as you can see, momentum here is very high, but there's kind of like some resistance, so they don't really let it, the price doesn't really react that much, but there's quite high volatility, quite high momentum. So yeah, you get some failed signals basically. But then eventually, when the actual move happens, you get another one down here, and in this case, the divergence is happening kind of like at the same time, right? So yeah, it's not 100% that every time this signal comes, a divergence will come afterwards. Sometimes, especially on the lower time frames, it will come like right at the same time or later, or sometimes the divergence has kind of already happened. And yeah, that's more of a, you know, a case by case basis. So definitely don't trade this signal just by itself. I would recommend combining it with, you know, other methods and your preferred style of trading. And also keep in mind that what we're looking at is just an absolute asinine market that just is scam candle down, scam candle up. And yeah, so it's kind of hard to get reliable signals in this kind of market, right? Here again, bullish signal kind of comes in around this area. We wait for the divergence, and then there it is, and there's your basically your bottom for the next, you know, period. Let us switch to the 4 hour, which is kind of like a more intermediate kind of time frame. And you can kind of see how it operates, right? Right, so for example here, again, we get a few in a row, a big one here at this kind of area. It tells you that, you know, momentum has kind of like reached the peak, and then yeah, you create, but yeah, there's like FOMC stuff happening here, so that's, or whatever data driven point it was, right? You get another one here, which yeah, it doesn't really create any sort of divergence, but it still is, even though this is like a smaller reaction, it still tells you where the bottom kind of is likely, right? Then the next one is also pretty decent, right? Comes in around this area, and yeah, if your stop is down here, then well, you know, your trade would be safe during all this kind of like period, right? Until you eventually kind of like get hit here. So yeah, it's, as a matter of fact, you get another one here and another red one here. So yeah, you can see that it's pretty consistent. It's pretty good. I quite like it, to be honest. But yeah, it does require some nuance, right? So don't and just for good measure, just let me show you the 5 minute. If you're like a intense scalper kind of person that just, you know, trades very low time frame, goes full degen with max leverage and stuff, like, I don't recommend it, but it gives some pretty decent signals, right? Especially when you start combining this with what we'll cover after this, which is the volume part. Yeah, it's, you know, gives you a blue signal here, gives you a red signal there, blue signal throughout this area, right? And then yeah, you get a red one here, a red one there, and another one there. Then the divergence comes in, right? It gives you another blue one here. So yeah, it's pretty reliable even on the 5 minute if you know how to combine it with other signals, right? So yeah, I hope that's enough to kind of showcase what it does. And let me just go back to the daily to kind of reset our charts. And yeah, anything else that I missed? I don't think so. Yes, I did. Significant support resistance level for the minimum momentum, right? So if you have an orange signal that comes in around here, what you can actually also do is take those candles, take a boxy in, let's say, orange color, right? Because the signal is orange. Just kind of draw a boxy around this area, and what you'll see is that these are actually like pretty important levels, right? So you can see how price kind of reacts to that level from there onward. It's usually because they also tend to coincide with point of control. If you're what's it called, volume profile kind of user, these things, right? There you go, right? So they tend to coincide with, you know, specific ranges, point of controls and stuff. Because yeah, price spends a lot of time in this area, so there's a lot of volume traded, even though momentum is very low. And then yeah, that kind of creates a sort of a a significant support resistance level. And then, yeah, so often followed by a small fake out before bigger move in the opposite direction. Yeah, we already covered that. So, yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next part. That pretty much covers all the oscillator stuff. So you have the RSI and the MQZ. Maybe in the future I will add more oscillators, but we'll see. For now, I don't really use them myself. So, but if there's any sort of requests from users, then I might consider adding one or two more. We'll see how it goes. Right. So the last part is the volume profile. And what this does is it's essentially just a standard volume indicator, but I've customized it a little bit to make it a bit more, just some quality of life improvements, I guess. And one of the things is that, well, if we turn it on, you can actually see that it doesn't work on the daily. That's because you need to activate this display on all time frames. But yeah, it's just your regular volume profile as if you would use one of the standard indicators. So let's see, volume here. There we go. A little bit faint. Let me just this a little bit thicker. There we go. So you can see it still follows the same pattern. So there's nothing changed. The only difference is that if I were to take this volume indicator and then move to existing pane below, then let me see, let me hide this, right? And then add relative strength, and then move that one here, move to above. Now it works. Is it because my QuantiZer is there? Wait, since when does this work? Are they on the same scale or not? No scale. Into right scale. Did they change this? Into scale A. Ah, there we go. Right. So I guess you can put it on no scale then, and then it doesn't do that. Interesting. No scale, full screen. I see. All right. Well, the more you know. But yeah, basically my indicator does the same thing in one, right? So if you were to use the same scale, what it does is it actually flattens the RSI, right? The RSI is now, because these numbers of volume are so high, and the RSI is only from a range from 0 to 100, then since these values are so extremely high, it just gets completely squashed. Right? So yeah, my indicator basically does kind of like the same thing in the sense that you can use, let me load it back up. Oop, there we go. Right, so you can load it back up, and then it shows volume on the background of the oscillators. Now, obviously, this particular color scheme is kind of obnoxious, and it kind of like, you know, interferes quite a bit and makes everything like hard to see. So there's a bunch of options that you can use to mitigate that, essentially. The way I personally like to use it is I override the indicator setting, right? So instead of using the indicator setting here and having it synchronized with light mode, I actually put this on monochrome, which then turns the entire thing just simply gray. It's handled by this color here. So you can set this a bit higher if it's too faint. Right? That's just kind of like how you prefer to do it. I personally, for example, like in this case area, because it kind of just meshes a bit better with the oscillators. but there's different options. Like for example, let's increase this a little bit so it's a bit better, a bit easier to see. You can also, for example, put it on circles, and it will create just kind of like a circle thing, just bouncing up and down. You can use histogram, which if you notice, it has like a tiny little dots at the bottom as well, so it's kind of like a little custom thingy that I added just for extra clarity. There's more color themes in this case. You can have a signal of high volume profile, which is the signal that I will explain in just a minute, and then also synchronize that with the MQZ signals itself. But for that you need to wait. I'm doing something wrong. All right. Oh no, I'm not doing it wrong. This is just something that, yeah. The reason I don't usually use this on high time frame, like the daily, for example, is because I personally use it more like the volume signals for low time frame kind of entry spotting, as I'll show in a minute. But yeah, as you can see, just ignoring the orange one for just a little bit, let me just kind of go to the 4 hour. Maybe that's a bit better. Yeah. So now the volume candles are actually synchronized with the MQZ signals, right? So there's different ways of displaying the signals, right? You can now, for example, deactivate this, and it's actually a bit easier to see the signals. Let me just change this to purple or something, so it's not the same color as the MQZ minimum signal. Right? And all that the high volume profile signal does. So where is it here? So signal HVP, which also lights up on the Confluence Tracker, right? What it means is that since my volume indicator is now scaled to the same scale as the RSI, so it's scaled from 0 to 100. Anytime it interacts with the band of the RSI, it will trigger a signal as high volume, like volume out of the ordinary, right? You can change that setting here. This, if we check the tooltips, we can see setting 1 is the volume profile plot style. Setting 2 is the volume profile plot width. So if you want to have bigger histogram bars, you can like do that here, right? Bigger, fatter, so it's a bit more visible. And then here, this last setting is HVP signal threshold. Minimum value is 10, maximum value is 80, right? So here you can basically tell the indicator from which point onwards should it consider a high volume bar as worthy of a signal. Its default setting is 30, so when it interacts with the lower band of the RSI, as you can see here, this bar pierces this band, so that's why it triggers purple, right? These ones don't, so they just kind of get ignored, and then this one also triggers that, right? So if we set this to 50, for example, right, now it's actually tracking the midsection of the band, right? So once I hit enter, this signal is going to disappear, but these ones are going to stay because the volume is actually interacting with the 50 band, right? Yeah, that's basically how that works, right? So the way I tend to use this is usually on lower time frames, so on the 1 hour or lower. And the reason why is because if you look at especially perp charts, so futures charts, usually the volume just overall throughout, you know, most of the day is just kind of low, right? There's really not much happening. It's only during liquidation events that volume actually spikes that high that it will trigger a signal, right? But usually those, if you zoom out, are actually the moments that you want to look for entries, right? Because like, look, it signals here, right? Because there's high volume coming in through these bars, right? And the next signal comes in here, right, on this candle, but then it creates a divergence, right after. Why? Because, well, all these stops here are getting liquidated by this candle, right? So a good way of, or at least the way I use it, is that what I do is I take the high volume profile. So I first configure this however I want this to trigger. Once it's set up, I turn on the high volume profile bar signal, right? And then what I do is go to the oscillator here, add an alert, call this the, make sure it's on any alert function call, set your expiration, and then give it a name like HVP, so high volume profile alert, right? You create the alert, and then every time one of these candles happens on the 1 hour on this particular chart, it will give you a signal like, hey, there's just been a liquidation candle, right? And that kind of tells me, hey, time to pay attention to the chart and look for, you know, a short or long or whatever it happens to be, right? You can see there's probably one active here, right? So even on the 5 minutes, right? 5 minute HVP alert. I have an alert that's just permanently running on the Bitcoin perp chart. And every time this happens, I just get a notification like, hey, there's been a liquidation candle, right? Oops. So you can see on the 5 minutes, similar concept. Let's just wait for it to load, right? Here you do tend to get like a few more in succession, right? Because this whole kind of spike thing is just big volume coming through. So yeah, you get one here, you get one there, right? Right, there's another one here. Right, so it kind of helps you pretty much ignore all this bullshit on the 5 minute, right? There's nothing interesting happening here, at least in my opinion, right? Right, if you want to make some small scalp trades on the 5 minute, then it's much better to enter right after this liquidation event. Take a short here, write it down to this support level, and then, you know, go out. Ignore all of this, right? Right. That's kind of like how I tend to use it. Let's find maybe some more examples. Like for example here, right? We get a couple of high volume signals one after the other, as you can see. In the meantime, we get some bullish signals from the momentum. As you can see, momentum is like maximum here, it's rolling over. After that, the divergence comes in, right? We get one last volume spike on this candle here, and kind of like this is your ideal entry point, right? Now, I'm also not an expert at, you know, completely nailing these sort of entries. I'm still working at getting better at that. But yeah, this is kind of like how I'm currently using it, right? And it's a pretty decent spot to, you know, maybe you can enter here or here once this happens, and you can, you know, write it up for a little bit. And then you get another one around here, which is this candle with the giant wick, right? You get one more sweep down, one more liquidity grab, and then after that is kind of like when you can actually make a nice move upwards, right? And yeah, you would have to kind of figure out where your exit signal would be. Maybe it's the range high, right? Something like that, or this area. That's kind of up to you to figure out where you want to take profit. Yeah, here we have some more, right? You get a big candle, big liquidation candle. Again, you can see a little bit of let me just activate the background again so it's a bit easier to see. You get a momentum signal. After that comes the divergence. We had a big volume here again on this candle here as well. And yeah, that kind of marks the bottom for where you would like to have an entry, right? Maybe you missed this, but you managed to snap an entry here, and then you can write it up. You get another sell signal from the MQZ Oscillator here because momentum has peaked, which tells you that, you know, start looking for divergence, which then comes in like a little bit later. Once it loses this level, you take your short here, for example, put your stop up there, or here, depending on what your risk appetite is, and then you can write it down, right? So that's kind of like how I tend to use it, right? Let's go back, see what else is there to say about the volume thing. Yeah, pretty much those are the options. I hope that makes sense. Let's see. Important to note, again, like it says in the tooltip here, threshold settings will affect alerts, so make sure to configure them properly before creating these alerts, right? So yeah, like I said, if you want to create this alert, just make sure that you configure it properly. Yeah, another thing that I would note is this is how I use it on Bitcoin mostly, but maybe if you look at if you have some other charts, like, I don't know, for example, you're trading Pepe, right? You might want to, before configuring the high volume profile signal threshold, this number, just kind of have a look, right? If you want to trade this on the 1 hour or on the 4 hour or whatever it happens to be, in this case, this is not a good chart because it doesn't show much of a volume at all. Let's find something better. Maybe Sol. Yeah, Sol, right? But as you can see, like here, for example, it triggers quite often, right? I'm not saying that you should do this on Sol, but whatever chart you want to use this on, you would just kind of like go through the history, kind of see what level gets triggered often enough that it warrants a signal, but also maybe it's not so low that it triggers too much, right? So kind of find where the middle ground is for that signal and then put your HVP level there, right? So maybe on Bitcoin I use 30, but maybe on another chart I would actually choose 40 because it just fits a bit better for that chart in particular, given how the volume on that chart happens to be in reality, right? So yeah, just play around with it, see what works for you, see what setting you like, and then yeah. Yeah, and as I said, since I use this signal mostly for lower time frame entries, not so much for higher time frame stuff, then yeah, I have this option here that just allows you to turn it off completely, so it doesn't bother you when you're on higher time frame charts, right? But yeah, that's just personal preference, I suppose. Yeah, in terms of alerts, so pretty straightforward, I suppose. Downside, so MQZ oscillator, downside momentum, upside momentum, and losing momentum. These are the blue signals, the red signals, and the yellow signals, and these trigger at the start, right? So the first three is when it enters the zone, if you will, right? So right here, right there, and right there. And then max downside momentum and max upside momentum and min losing momentum is when those end, right? So that's where the zone ends and momentum actually shifts, right? So you can choose if you want to have alerts that let you know when it's starting or when the zone actually ends, right? So that's just two different options. Same for the RSI. So remember how I explained that the RSI actually uses two confirmation bars? You can have the unconfirmed alerts. So that means that there's only has been one confirmation bar so far. The signal is already appearing on the chart, but the second confirmation bar has not yet been locked in, right? So these two alerts will trigger when there's one confirmation bar for an RSI divergence, and then you have the other one, which is the actual locked in double confirmation RSI bearish divergence, fully locked in, and yeah. So you can choose whichever one you want or activate them all. That's up to you. Yeah, one final kind of touch upon the Confluence Tracker that I kind of went over a little bit, but yeah. So basically, what it's doing, it's tracking momentum signals, it's tracking divergence signals, and it's tracking the high volume profile signals from the high volume, right? And what we can do is, if we look at this chart, there's a bunch of signals here, right? So if we just take the replay tool and just put it somewhere here, and just let's give this like a 3x speed so it doesn't go too fast. Just pay attention to how this behaves as the chart progresses, right? right? So now it triggers the minimum signal, but then after 6 bars it turns off, right? Triggers the maximum momentum to the downside signal. After 6 bars it turns off. Right? Bearish divergence comes in, keeps the signal active for 6 bars, and then turns it off. Right? You kind of get the idea, I suppose. Let's speed it up. So yeah, you can kind of see it flashing. So this is just an easy visual way of kind of like telling what, if you're like, you know, scanning through your charts, maybe you're once a week going over all the alts that you're following or something, you can just kind of like quickly glance, see if any of these signals kind of light up, and it can kind of give you a quick, you know, visual indication of, hey, there's bearish divergence or bullish divergence without even having to look at the oscillators or anything, right? You can basically have this completely off if you want. You can turn this off and this off. Right, have nothing. Even the background is off, right? And you can still take advantage of those signals. Let's do it again so you can kind of see. Right, so the signals are still triggering. Right, so let's say, for example, you're a user of the profits indicator suite from Roman that I mentioned in the previous video. I think it's prophecy, right? That, yeah. Right, so what you can do is you can stack these together, move to existing plane below. So now they're stacked on top of each other, right? You can just take the profits indicator, use it however you use it yourself, as you usually do. Let's see, oscillators, RSI on. That should pop the RSI. There we go. Divergences. Where are the golden pepes? There we go. Are there any? Ah, I think you need to activate this. Maybe yes. There we go. Right. So maybe you like to use it like this. And what this allows is that it just hides the oscillators that I have, which are essentially just kind of like the same, right? Because you don't really need them. They're displaying the same oscillator, essentially, right? But then you can have my signals basically on in the background, for example, right? Or have only the Confluence Tracker in the corner while you just enjoy your Prophecy indicator, basically, right? And as you can see, it's now creating 2 different scales. So to deal with that, you just pin to scale A, which is the other one, right? So now you only have 1 scale. Right, so now they're on the same scale, they don't occupy extra real estate, and yeah. Let's see, what else? Yeah, so that's how that works. Let's reactivate everything. Yeah, and then remember I explained the positioning, so you can choose where to position it if you want to have it in the center or in the corners, if you like to have those buttons that TradingView has in the corner there. And then you can also extend the signal or diminish it, right? So let's say you want to keep the signal alive longer than 6, you want to keep it for 10 bars, right? So then you can actually have the signal trigger much longer. Oh shit, I should actually have, yeah. So here, let's quickly just kind of see, right? The zone ends here, but the signal is still active, and it will stay active for the next 10 bars, basically, right? So 10 bars later, that's when it actually turns off. I would recommend not setting it too high either, because then you can kind of get into the problem of signals kind of overlapping each other. Yeah, so just keep it in mind. It's a quality of life feature. You're not forced to use it. If you don't like it, just turn it off, I guess. Yeah, but it's there if you like it and you want it. And just keep in mind that also it has quite a bunch of tooltips in there that have like extra information in case you're new to the oscillator and kind of want to know how it works and stuff, right? Did we check this? I don't think so. Yeah, momentum quant has a high volume profile, intraday time frames, confirms in real time, so there's no delay to this signal. It instantly, if the volume bar hits the lower band, let me activate it again. We're on the daily. As you can see, it doesn't really trigger on the daily because the daily doesn't have enough volume to actually reach all the way into the band. And so let's go to the 4 hour. Any signal here? We're on the BTC pair, that's why. There we go. Now it triggers, right? So as soon as the volume bar hits the band, just instantly in real time, the signal will kind of like fire before the bar even closes, basically, right? That's what it means. Indicates when bars exceed average volume. So average volume is kind of like around this level, right? And when it exceeds it, then it's when it triggers. Indicates low time frame liquidation events, like I explained before. Recommended time frames 1 hour, 5 minutes. Anything in between, that's kind of like how I use it, but feel free to use it on any other time frame that you feel that it's useful for. And it's useful for filtering out potentially trend shifting RSI MQZ signals, right? So yeah, you can kind of combine it with the MQZ oscillator and RSI to kind of figure out where divergences and MQZ signals happen, and also there's some sort of volume liquidation event or something happening that just gives you a bit more confluence in terms of it potentially being a trend shifting place on the chart, basically. All right, I think that should be pretty much it. How long? Oh, this video is already 1 hour and 20 minutes long, way longer than I expected it to be. Yeah, I think I will leave it here. I think that pretty much covers most of it. If you guys have any other questions, just leave a comment or something, or contact me in private in Discord if we know each other. Yeah, feel free to ask any questions. I will be happy to kind of explain if something is still unclear. And yeah, I will leave it at that, and we'll see you in the next video where I will be covering the sacred geometry indicator. So that would be this one, right? We'll do that in the next one, and then we'll leave this one for last, which I probably will have to slice up in 2 parts, I think, because I'm expecting it to be quite extensive, but given how much time I've spent on this one, I'm scared to even start to think about how long this is going to take. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. All right, I'll leave it there. Signing off. See you guys in the next video.